Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're talking about what could seem like a perfect storm to those who've been following the topic of tax avoidance and tax evasion for years, if not decades. And that is to say, this summit that takes place Thursday in London, David Cameron's open mic remarks about countries that are fantastically corrupt taking part in that summit, and the Panama Papers and the whole discussion it has raised now over tax havens. Just before the break, we were talking about how the Panama Papers have shaped this conversation. Najim Animashound, I was perusing the Nigerian press. They were listing among the names most quoted in the Panama Papers the current and past presidents of the Nigerian Senate. How are the Panama Papers going to impact Nigerian politics?
Well, then they're not helping the Senate president, who's currently before the Code of Conduct Tribunal for failing to disclose his assets. His assets that he disclosed were substantially less than the assets that were found to be in his name. His wife was hauled up for interrogation before the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission to disclose sums that were in her accounts that she couldn't account for. There are properties in very upscale parts of London that are in the wife's name, and these properties are owned by companies that were registered by Mossack Fonseca. I mean, at the risk of sounding, banal, One Hyde Park, which is one of the most exclusive residencies in London, the apartments there start from like £5 million or some ridiculous amount of money like that. There are a handful of Nigerians that own property there who have no real source of income other than the government. So, and these are owned by companies that were registered by the likes of Mossack Fonseca. For the life of me, and this is just me, I don't understand why anybody doing legitimate business cannot register a company to own an asset in the country where they're doing the business. Why must you go to an offshore haven? Tax evasion? Maybe, but in more cases than one, if you're really doing legitimate business, I don't see the need for you to do that.
All right, so let's pick up on that point. And we heard just before the break, Pierre Habart talking about the fact that you need a holistic approach to all this. One comment coming to us on Facebook from Lucas, Cameron, the one pointing to Nigeria and Afghanistan, but his father was amongst those who had an account in fiscal paradise that the Panama Papers revealed. Corruption's everywhere, and you Westerners are the #1 culprits of trying to hide it. Chazroy Chaduri, I want your reaction to something that Najim just said, and that is all that real estate in the heart of London where you are, owned by Nigerians and other foreigners. What do you do about that?
Well, what the UK government's been doing is it's actually been raising taxes, what's called stamp duty on transactions. Now, what I'd like to say, though, about that and about the Panama Papers, it just seems to me what I've seen, and I've done a search on the database, as other people have probably done, and people's names that you might want to see, do they have anything there, and nothing's come up. But what I'd say is that there seem to be two categories. The one where people want confidentiality, people who are well known, so there might be some avoidance going on, which is perfectly legitimate, but nothing illegal. And there's the other side, where politicians from various jurisdictions have tried to, funds they've perhaps got hold of, which they may not have been entitled to, have used Panama as a source for which they used to squirrel away those funds. So again, that isn't necessarily evasion. That is something to do with embezzlement or something else. So the idea of tax evasion, I haven't seen the evidence on tax evasion. I understand some of the papers haven't been disclosed yet. The journalists have decided to censor those for the time being. So there'll be more coming out. So what I say is about tax havens in general is that as long as the people using tax havens declare the money in the jurisdiction where they should be paying the tax, there's nothing wrong with tax haven. If they're not doing that, they're evading tax, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law and locked away. But what I've seen, as I was saying, is that a lot of well-known people are trying to use tax or the Panama leaked papers, tax havens to show, not let people know how wealthy they are. And I think that is perfectly within the law in any jurisdiction you're in. And I think you mentioned in the intro about Delaware corporations, you mentioned about the UK. And in the UK, one of the things that your guest said, we've actually opened up, we've got a register that's open since April this year of membership of companies. And I guess that will then grow eventually to trust. But I think it's the only jurisdiction I'm aware of which has created such transparency over and above any other advanced economy or less advanced economy. So I think it's a step in the right direction. There's more to do, but I think we just need to be very careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of making our various jurisdictions bad places, as I said, reputationally damaging, as Europe already has become in some cases, to do business.
Let me bring in Pierre Abar, whose boss again at the Trade Union Advisory Committee has signed that petition of more than 300 economists calling for a blanket end to tax havens. You just heard Chaz Roy Chowdhury say, nothing wrong with tax havens, as long as you declare everything, as long as everything's above board.
Yeah, absolutely. Chaz, I mean, I hear what Chaz is saying. I mean, Chaz, in a sense, you are trying to make a subtle distinction between tax evasion and what you say is legitimate tax avoidance. The OECD has delivered an action plan last year called Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan, which precisely tell us that tax avoidance in many cases is not legitimate. The main point, I guess, is that indeed there may be some cases where tax avoidance may be considered as can be tolerated. But what matters is that whether it's tax evasion, corruption, avoidance, it's the instruments that matters. And it all boils down to the same principles: opacity, lengthening in the investment chain. That's why, and that's really important, because I think Chaz is perhaps not too enthusiastic about that, we need public reporting, country by country reporting.
Because this is the argument.
We can't let it only.
This is the argument that's been made. The argument that we had when we talked right after the Panama Papers broke. Some people saying, yes, sometimes you need a neutral country where you can incorporate when you have business being done between separate jurisdictions, and there is a legitimate need for that. So, is this blanket call for a blanket ban on tax havens a good thing or a bad thing?
A blanket ban on tax havens, as long as we can have strong criteria for defining what a tax haven is. You know, that's and that's still ongoing work in a sense, because nobody, the EU, the OECD, and NGOs don't necessarily agree on the criteria. But the most important is to have public reporting, because that matters for citizens, but also for investors, for workers, to have a clear picture of large businesses, map out the risk, map out where the business is held, and to spot anomalies between different jurisdictions where they operate.
Do you agree? As long as everything's above board, the British Virgin Islands can go on with their system?
I think what is clear here is that we have an opaque system that is being used for a lot of illegal activities, from tax evasion, corruption, funding of terrorism, all kinds of things. And it's clear that we can't just go on with this system and just do a business as we did in the past. And I think the Panama Papers are we have had so many scandals. If we're not moving now, I don't know what else we need, what other kind of evidence we need to put an end to this opacity. And I think if it's true that someone can set up a company elsewhere in the world for legitimate reasons, then he shouldn't need to hide behind it. And this is what we're asking for. We're just asking who is the physical person behind a company or a trust. And I think this is a legitimate question to ask. And this is a kind of the basic minimum of transparency that we need. And as Pierre said, we also need a basic minimum of transparency of what our multinationals do abroad. And I think then we can talk. I think really no one should be defending the existing system, because I think the abuses have been very clear. I'm not saying that everyone who's listed in the Panama Papers is doing illegal activities. But if they're not doing any illegal activities,
not necessarily an illegal activity, but they're trying to avoid tax in most instances.
But if you look at the Panama Papers, right, what you see is not just like someone has incorporated a business somewhere, let's say in Panama. What you see is a spider web. You see a spider web of people having set up a company, a shell company in Panama, having a trust elsewhere, and then setting up something else. Honestly, I mean, there's something illegal going on here. And I think things are shifting very rapidly. Though we have had a gray zone in the past, a lot of work has been done in the past with the OECD, with the G20 and so on, and it's pretty clear that we just can't go on with the system. And at the moment, developing countries are losing out on at least $1 trillion US dollars a year because of illicit financial flows of all kinds, corruption, tax evasion, and so on. This is a lot of money that can't be taxed properly, that can't be reinvested in public health, in education, and so on. No one can tell me that we can go on with this system. And I think it is a basic minimum that we're asking for transparency to become the default. At the moment, the default is opacity. And I think this is, honestly, we shouldn't even be discussing this, I feel. I mean, how can we not be asking these basic questions of who's behind the company, who's owning a trust, who's paying taxes where? I think this is really the basic.
Najim Animashaun, 1 year ago, we were in Abuja for the France 24 debate. You were with us, and we were talking about just how a Herculean a task it would be for the incoming president to recover some of the money that had been stolen in his country. The fact that all this is being put on the table now in London this Thursday, would you say the mountain has come to Muhammad?
Indeed, or indeed Muhammad has come to the mountain, since he's got to persuade David Cameron to go after the illicit assets in the form of bricks and mortar on the streets of London. Look, I was looking at the oil revenues in Nigeria and trying to tally the amount of the oil revenues as against the benchmark price for oil. And with some friends, we did some calculations. And basically, the excess crude account, and that is the difference in the actual price of the oil and the revenues that were received from the government, as opposed to the price that the government set for the budget, which is the excess, what the excess is. Over the last, I think it's 8 years, Nigeria should have had something to the tune of $160 billion in the excess crude account. Now, what is in the excess crude account today? Less than $1 billion. So we've got some serious questions that we've got to ask our leaders. Where the hell did this money go? Now, it's interesting that, Chaz is talking about confidentiality and the legitimate reasons why people should actually use tax havens. And your two other guests are talking about opacity. And both words mean the same thing, in the sense that you don't want people to know what you're doing. But one is sinister and the other isn't. The fact is that the only way I see that the West and other developed countries can help my country, for example, is to have those who actually run these havens to register and force people who incorporate companies to disclose who the real owners are.
To disclose who their real owners are. And on that point, Najim Animashaun, you have the endorsement of Barack Obama, the U.S. president, last week unveiling measures requiring banks and other financial institutions to know, verify, and report the real people behind shell corporations, promising as well to go after foreigners who, quote, hide behind anonymous shell companies formed inside the United States. Of course, there is a caveat. We're going to hear Barack Obama say it. It's whether or not the U.S. Congress goes along with it.
I'm calling on Congress to pass new legislation that requires all companies formed inside the United States to report information about their real owners to the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network.
Frédéric Redeau, what does your crystal ball tell you?
Even if Congress passes this measure, it's totally insufficient. I mean, what he's talking about is actually relying on financial institutions to provide us the information, right? This is the system that we've been working with in other countries, and that has failed. What we need is public registers. It's really the only way to go. And I think to reuse measures that we've been using in the past and that haven't worked, it's not going to work now. What we need is really obviously a stricter regulation on companies and also on the financial institutions such as banks, lawyers, and so on that help set up these companies. But we also need to collect this information in a central place, in a register, and open this up to public scrutiny. Honestly, we can't just continue with the system we had in the past. Otherwise, we will have Panama Papers 2, we will have LuxLeaks 3, and so on and so on. And I totally see what the President, Barack Obama, is trying to do. It's definitely a step in the right direction, but it's insufficient.
Chaz Roy-Chaudhuri, sunlight is the best disinfectant, as a Supreme Court justice once said.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and I think Barack Obama is being a great politician because he knows that the measure will never go through Congress because of the way that the US is moribund politically, and I think Delaware corporations are the biggest users of opacity in the advanced world. But what I'd also say is that under the BEPS proposal, which was mentioned earlier, the OECD work which you've inputted into, and ACCA, we work in the public interest. We don't, we're not an NGO and we don't have a political axe to grind. We aren't a business. We don't have a political interest in that respect. But what I think needs to happen is that there needs to be full disclosure between tax authorities of information, because there's no tax authority that's going to give up revenue they're entitled to. And so these tax havens need to disclose, which they're already doing under the OECD information exchange agreements that are going on, full exchange of information with tax authorities, so that tax authorities can go after those individuals in the full knowledge of what they've got, what they should be declaring. And I think that's the best way of doing it, rather than having the floodlight of disclosure on those individuals who may just disappear. They may, the world is getting smaller. There are less places to hide, but there are still places which individuals with a lot of money can go to. Corporations can bypass jurisdictions they don't like. So I think we need to be realistic in what we do. The status quo isn't that's acceptable anymore. The BEPS work, the financial crisis has changed that. There's a paradigm shift in what individuals and businesses now expect, certainly in the UK and the US and much of the advanced economies around the world. And we need to go with that in a way that's methodical, works, and still allows growth and prosperity for all of us.
All right, let me bring in Pierre Abad, because I've heard that argument made a lot. That okay, right now it's British Crown dependencies, places like the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, etc. But if we go too far with all of this, well, it's going to go to places like Hong Kong that are under less scrutiny, even less scrutiny, and it'll be even harder to track the money.
Now, that's why we need some leadership, be it from the G20 or from the United Nations. Right now, it's with the G20, and behind the G20, it's with the OECD. We need, again, some common agreement. The BEPS action plan, the OECD action plan on tax avoidance, indeed delivered some country-by-country reporting. It's a reporting system that which will limit the conversation between managers, CEOs, and their many tax lawyers on the one hand, with tax administrations on the other. Okay, and frankly, it would be easy for tax lawyers to game all those tax administrations, even the more sophisticated one from the US or France. Forget about the Nigerian tax authorities. Okay, that's why we need public disclosure. And we will surely contest that any information that's contained, that will be contained in the country-by-country reporting, will in any way could anyway threaten business confidentiality. This is basic information that's informed investors, long-term investors.
And what about the argument about these shell companies then going to even more opaque places?
Frankly, if you get Singapore in the loop, okay, if you get all the financial centers, you are moving a good step ahead. The most important is to change the political debates in some countries. In the US, it's a very complicated situation today. Okay, so one is to move ahead with American NGOs and the labor movement to change the terms of the debate on tax transparency in the US. Because what is also important with the Obama discussion previously is that we should not stigmatize Nigeria. We should not stigmatize Afghanistan. There is always, when it comes to corruption or tax evasion, there is one corrupted and there is one corrupting. Okay. And so even in the heart of Europe, good old Europe, the Netherlands attract more investment flow from Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and Curaçao than from the entire Nordic countries. Okay, that's abnormal. So we should. So it's indeed about overseas territories of the British Crown, French overseas territories, or whatever. But it's also about the Delaware state, the Wyoming state in the U.S.
But you heard Federica there saying, and you heard as well Chaz, both saying that this isn't going to happen in the U.S. They're going to keep on going the way they are right now.
Well, we should be optimistic. The Congress situation, I guess, is a complicated one. But the first battle is on tax transparency, step by step. Okay. In the U.S., I won't go into the politics in the U.S., but there is a possibility with constituencies like NGOs, with the labor movement, to move step by step and tell to the people tax transparency, financial transparency matters to all, not just authorities. It matters for the citizens, NGOs, investors, among others.
All right, so these calls for transparency, for a holistic approach in a globalized world, but it's all happening in a political context where, we've got a Brexit referendum coming up, growing Euroscepticism, increased nationalism. Will people want to share information in this kind of climate?
I think what is happening is that there's more and more public pressure on governments, and I think things will be changing very rapidly. And actually, we've already seen a lot of change happening, and more needs to happen. And I think what is important, and it's been said, is that the public pressure needs to be there, and this is also why we need to have access to this data. Because it's in the end, it's about citizens putting their pressure on governments, because we know very well that otherwise things won't be moving. And I think what is important here is that we really have a global debate. So what is happening is that a lot of things are changing at the moment, for instance, at the G20 level with the work on the OECD. But it's really, really important that we also include poor countries from the beginning onwards. Because you were saying, we might close one loophole, let's say, in the UK, but then people will be moving to Hong Kong. Even worse, what we might be seeing is the emergence of new tax havens in poor countries. And we need this is why we need a global approach. It doesn't make things easier, but this is the only way to go to find a really sustainable solution to this problem. And we will only get it with public scrutiny, with public pressure. And I think people are now aware of what is happening. They are now aware how big the problem is about corruption, tax evasion, and so on. And they won't keep quiet. I mean, they will asking their governments to deliver.
All right, Frédéric Rodin, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Pierre Habart, Najim Animashaun for being with us from Abuja, and Chaz Roy Chowdhury in London. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. So a gaffe-prone garden party at Buckingham Palace, and it indeed has made headlines across the British press and the world's press. You can see here on the Financial Times, Cameron insults key nations on eve of global corruption summit. So just some of the reactions to that. You can see here somebody interpreting how the Queen might have reacted in that moment but of course she wasn't aware it was being filmed, and then she made a gaffe herself, so it's not really probably very factual. Others, of course, turning it back on David Cameron, saying, hold on a minute, talk of corruption, it's not as if, the Conservative Party is completely clean. Seven police forces have launched criminal investigations into Conservative MPs for potential electoral fraud. That's just one example of potential corruption.
Because let's just remind our viewers here, in less than 24 hours, 2 open mic incidences, the Queen involved in both of them. In one case, she keeps a stony silence. In the other, she intercedes.
That's right. Just before we get to the Queen's incident, this remark: no wonder politicians lie all the time if this is how we respond when they say something that is quite evidently true. Right, we'll maybe leave that one aside. But in any case, getting to the Queen, when it comes to China, the Queen's gaffe reveals some inconvenient truths. There, you can see here the quote, they were very rude to the ambassador. This was in reference, of course, to the Chinese state visit 7 months ago.
Pierre Habart, is it a gaffe? Is it a gaffe what the Queen said?
It's a helpful gaffe, so to speak, if I may.
It's not something meant for public consumption that gets thrown out there.
Well, it allows for a debate, an issue which is highly complex and can be a bit boring, to be made, to reach out to regular citizens,
Well, I think there's an element of debate about it. The Chancellor, of course, George Osborne in the UK, had been talking about building a special relationship with China. The state visit last year was presented as a success, but apparently there were tensions. So one interpretation of all of this in The Guardian, coming from Mary Dejevsky, is that it was A, a diplomatic gaffe, B, an attempt to send a message to the Chinese, quite elaborate way of sending a message, or C, a statement of fact. Perhaps all three, she says. But in any case, what is unusual here is the Queen is a diplomatic professional in the business for, well, not sure you call it the business, but for a long, long time. She has never really made any gaffe of this nature before, or there has never been any caught on the mic incident before. So we can only speculate now that Buckingham Palace is going to really tighten, I suppose, the restraints on videoing inside Buckingham Palace. So the Queen says the Chinese officials were rude to the ambassador. No, Ferrero Rocher for them. Rocher for them, rather. A lot of people defending the Queen, others saying, well, maybe there was an element of truth in what she said. So it obviously got a lot of attention on social media, François.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creed. And I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.